Story of a very wealthy and righteous man, Job, is told in the Old Testament. He lost his wealth, his children, and his health. Obviously, he grieved. The story starts with how he lost everything, then the counsel of his four friends, then God's answer to those four friends, and finally, Job's restoration of family, wealth, and health. Job probably lived in the time of the patriarchs, although he could have lived any time from a little before Abraham up until the time of the Assyrian Empire. If Job lived after the conquest of the Promised Land under Joshua, then Job was not an Israelite, since he didn't practice the law. But there were plenty of faithful people who were not Israelites recorded in the Old Testament. So, beginning in chapter 1, verses 1 through 5, Job's children and his considerable livestock are detailed. As an example of his concern for his family, he regularly sacrificed for each of his children, just in case one or more of them had sinned. And then in chapter 1, verse 6, the scene shifts to heaven. Satan was in the presence of God, which was the case until the war in heaven described in Revelation 12, which took place shortly after Jesus went home, when Satan and his angels were exiled from heaven to earth for a short time. God comments to Satan about the character and the faithfulness of Job. Satan claims that Job's faithfulness was only because he had been protected by God, that if Job were to lose it all, surely Job would curse God. God gives Satan permission to do as he wishes with Job's wealth and his family, but God forbade him from touching Job's person. Well, in chapter 1, verse 13, begins the devastation that besets Job. Although the text does not directly say that Satan did it, the implication is clear. Arabs raided and took the oxen and the donkeys and killed the servants. Further, fire came from heaven and consumed the sheep and those servants. Then Chaldeans, today's Iraqis, raided, taking the camels and killed those servants. Finally, a great wind struck the house of one of Job's children, his oldest son, during a party, and all the children died. Job, of course, grieved, tore his robe, shaved his head, fell on the ground, but continued to worship God and did not charge God with wrong. Chapter 2 shifts back to heaven. Despite losing the bet with God, Satan claims that Job continued to worship God only because he himself had not been harmed, that if he were personally harmed, he would curse God. So God gave Satan permission to harm Job's person, but not to take his life. So, beginning in chapter 2, verse 7, Satan struck Job with painful boils all over. Job's wife told Job to curse God and die. But although grieving, Job did not sin or blame God, rather saying, "Shall we not accept both good and adversity from God?" In chapter 2, verse 11, three of Job's friends, Eliphaz the Temanite, Bildad the Shuhite, and Zophar the Naamathite, heard of Job's plight, and came to comfort him in his grief. They sat with him 7 days without saying anything. A fourth person, Elihu the son of Barachiel, appears in chapter 32, who will be angry with Job for not taking responsibility for the catastrophe and being angry with Job's three friends for not being able to persuade Job to do it. Beginning in chapter 38, God finally breaks into the conversation and chastises all four, everyone but Job, for offering false concepts. So, we need to be careful about whom we quote in Job, since all the speeches by those four men, everyone but Job, were declared to be incorrect by God. Rather, the four men tried to persuade Job using the wisdom of the day. earthly wisdom, philosophy from men rather than from God. Note there are many passages in the Bible which are false. For example, in the Gospels, Jesus was accused one time of being crazy, another time of having a demon. Well, we know those aren't true. The words of people who were wrong are also recorded in the Bible. So in Job, most of the book is the speeches by four men who were declared to be wrong. So we must know the context of the scriptures that people quote to us, so we'll know whether they're meant to be true or not. Well, in chapter 3, Job broke the week-long silence with a speech, lamenting the day of his birth and longed for his own death. But he still did not blame God. In chapter 4, Eliphaz, the Temanite, speaks up. He tells him, "You have comforted others, but now it comes on you and you're upset. You've been trusting in yourself." So Eliphaz is just blaming Job for grieving, which is a silly thing to do. Eliphaz goes on and says, "Whoever perished being innocent?" Because Eliphaz believed that if you suffered or if you died, then it must be because you sinned. And so this is the result, Job. In chapter 4, verse 12, Eliphaz claims that he had a vision. So you ought to believe me. I mean, how many preachers get away with that one? In chapter 5, he tells Job, "If I were you, I would appeal to God." And later in chapter 5, verse 17, "Happy is the man whom God corrects." Essentially, he's telling Job, you sinned. Everybody knows that. So this is what happened to you. In chapter 5, verse 18 to the end of the chapter, he says, "Follow my advice and you'll get everything back." How many preachers use that one? Remember, later in the book, Eliphaz is told by God he has sinned greatly by speaking such lies. In chapter 6, Job responds to Eliphaz. And in chapter 6, verse 10, despite his anguish, Job says, "I have not concealed the words of the Holy One." And in chapter 6, verse 14, "To him who is afflicted, kindness should be shown by his friend." And so Job is complaining that his friend was not being very kind in his grief. And in chapter 6, verse 24, "Teach me, and I will hold my tongue. Cause me to understand wherein I have erred." And in chapter 6, verse 29, "Concede that my righteousness still stands." Have I sinned? What have I done to you, O watcher of men? Why have you set me as your target so that I'm a burden to myself? So Job's response to Eliphaz was, "You're not much of a friend, trying to tell me that what happened to me is my own fault. Where's the comfort?" Well, in chapter 8, Bildad the Shuhite puts in his little bit, and he says, "If your sons have sinned against him, he has cast them far from their transgressions." Isn't that a wonderful thing to do? Your friend has lost all of his sons in a natural disaster, and so you go and tell him, well, they wouldn't have died except for they sinned. I would feel you must be fortunate to have survived such an encounter. He tells Job, "If you were pure and upright, surely now he would awake for you." Telling Job, you're grieving just only because you're not pure and not upright. And at the end of the chapter, he says, "These are the paths of all who forget God." So despite chapter 1 that describes Job as a superbly faithful person, Bildad tells him, "Oh, well, this happened to you because you forgot about God." Well, chapter 9, Job answers Bildad. Job acknowledges that righteousness is from God. It's not something achieved by a person, but in verse 15, Job insists that his standing with God It's not because of legalism, doing everything flawlessly, but because he appeals for mercy. Essentially, he trusts God in times of adversity, not just in the good times. And in verse 22, God destroys both the blameless and the wicked. So adversity cannot be caused by sin. And in chapter 10, Job insists that he's not among the wicked. Well, the third friend, Zophar the Naamathite, speaks up. And he says, I'm not giving you any rationale here. I'm just going to label what you say as empty talk and as mocking God. It would help if he were to give some reasons for that, but see, he just dismisses what Job has to say as being, that's just empty talk. Zophar repeats the accusation that Job was receiving just what was due him from his iniquity, even though God had already declared him to be upright and faithful. So he just assumes that Job must be guilty of something. It's like that old argument that is used, that Zophar used the same one. God's thoughts are higher than our thoughts, so you need to just believe me. Admit your guilt, and God will restore your fortunes. I wonder if they ever considered the fact that many people died and they weren't necessarily all sinners. In chapter 12, Job answers Zophar. Sarcastically, Job responds, no doubt you are the people and the wisdom will die with you. Job claims that he claims that he has just as much or perhaps more wisdom than his friends. He contrasts building up and tearing down of people and nations, but neither can be solely attributed to the nation or the person's goodness or wickedness. Sometimes the wicked live long and prosperous lives. Sometimes the good die young, and sometimes not. Job claims to have greater wisdom than his friends and that their counsel has been worthless to him. But he has a great statement in chapter 13, verse 15. Though he, God, slay me, I will trust him. So Eliphaz the Temanite replies, his second turn. Should a wise man answer with empty knowledge? Of course, he gives no reason why Job's words are empty. He just discards whatever Job says as being empty. Your own mouth condemns you. Eliphaz assumes that anyone who doesn't agree with him must be wrong. What is a man that he should be pure? And essentially, it's the total depravity doctrine, which is opposite to what the scriptures say. He says, well, everybody knows that everybody is a total sinner and couldn't possibly please God. Yep, Calvinism is the way of Eliphaz. That theory's been around a very long time. So Job answers. He tells his friends, you are miserable comforters. But I, if I were in your place, I would strengthen you with my mouth and the comfort of my lips, and would relieve your grief. No violence was in his hand, and his prayer was pure, he says. Surely even now my witness is in heaven, and my evidence is on high. Well, we know that's true because chapter 1 said so. Well, in chapter 18, Bildad the Shuhite answers the second time. He tells Job, gain understanding, and afterward I will speak. He tells Job, you're just too ignorant for me to talk to. You need to go back to school and learn, and then maybe we can have a conversation. First, that's terribly arrogant. Secondly, he's doing nothing to comfort his friend. He tells Job, surely even now my witness is in heaven and my evidence is on high. He says, such a thing, such terrible things as what happened to you only happen to the dwellings of the wicked. Everybody knows that. which of course is false. And this is the place of him who doesn't know God. So his comfort to Job is, look, these bad things only happen to the wicked, so you must be the wicked. And these things only happen to those who don't know God, so you must not know God. Yeah. Well, Job answers. Job recognizes that the simplistic evil causes suffering is just wrong. The righteous also suffer. See, the legalist can find fault in anyone. Those of faith trust God for their acceptability through faith. See, Job knew that long before Jesus came along. Well, of course, we all know that Abraham knew that, and Job knew it too. And Job has a great line that has been made into a pretty good song. I know that my Redeemer lives and shall stand at last on the earth. So Job understood that God would provide the Redeemer for people. He didn't know how it was going to work, but he did know that God would provide that Redeemer, which of course was Jesus. But a great line, I know that my Redeemer lives. So Zophar comes back for his second time. He tells Job the triumph of the wicked is short, and the joy of the wicked is but for a moment. And Zophar asserts that the wicked succeed only briefly and are brought down by God shortly while they yet live. And of course, we all know that that's just not true. We just need to look at the world around us and know that many wicked people succeed for a long time and really live comfortably until the day they die. So Job responds in chapter 21. Why do the wicked live and become old? Yes, become mighty in power. He's challenging Zophar's observation that wicked people always fall quickly. And Job says, oh no, they don't. He says, the righteous and the wicked lie down alike in the dust and worms cover them. They all die. Job says, for the wicked are reserved for the day of doom. They shall be brought out in the day of wrath. So Job understands and expresses to his friends that no, wickedness will be handled at judgment. It doesn't happen on earth. Well, Eliphaz the Temanite responds again, his third go-round, and says, is it any pleasure to the Almighty that you are righteous? Now, what a strange thing to say. Does God care that you're righteous? Is it any gain to him that you make your ways blameless? Now, for his two previous speeches, he's been telling Job that, oh, well, you're wicked and you have sinned before God. And now he's changing his tune. Does God take any pleasure in righteousness? Is it any gain to God that you're blameless? He gives up on blaming Job and he switches to saying that righteousness is pointless. You see that he's not a very consistent person. Eliphaz makes real accusations that were contradicted in chapter 1. God's description of Job and Eliphaz's description of Job are markedly different. Eliphaz is in chapter 2, verses 5 through 9. So he again insults Job by calling him ignorant, saying, now acquaint yourself with him, with God, and be at peace. Thereby good will come to you. He accuses Job of being ignorant of God, which we know from chapter 1 is not true, and that all will be well if Job comes around to their way of thinking, the health and wealth doctrine. Many a preacher uses that approach to tells people they're ignorant and they just need to do what I say, and then you will have health and wealth. In chapter 23, Job responds again. Would he, God, contend with me in his great power? No, but he would take note of me. There the upright could reason with him, and I would be delivered forever from my judge. See, Job's idea of God is of someone with whom he can converse, he can talk, he can reason, and God will deliver him. When he has tested me, I shall come forth as gold. He's saying, yeah, let God go ahead and test me. I'll come out valued. He tells his friends, the souls of the wounded cry out, yet God does not charge them with wrong. I mean, just think of all the Psalms written by David when David was having difficult times. You know, he complains to God, and God still called him faithful. God doesn't charge people with wrong when they're grieving. Grief is a normal emotion, and our friends should carry us through it. But chapter 25, Bildad the Shuhite responds, how can man be righteous before God? Notice how they keep switching back and forth. They call Job ignorant, then they call him unrighteous, and, all these things. How can a man be pure who is born of woman? Again, he has the idea of total depravity, which is false. Solomon wrote, God made man upright. He goes astray in his schemes. But it's much easier to claim that, everybody is flawed and everybody is made totally depraved and God must make us believe, instead of having responsibility for our own choices. See, total depravity makes God responsible for all sin. In chapter 25, verse 6, how much less man who is a maggot and a son of man who is a worm? Yeah, that whole idea of we are worthless. God finds all people to be very valuable. The technique of making people feel worthless is just a means of getting people to follow me instead of God. Well, Job's long and final argument is from chapter 26 through chapter 31. Job accuses his so-called friends of being no help at all in his grief, succeeding only in blaming him. Job lists the good things he has done, which are also listed in chapter 1, not to justify himself, but in contradiction of the accusations of his friends. And his lament in chapter 30, beginning at verse 20, reads a lot like Psalm 22, which Jesus quoted. Well, in chapter 32, a fourth friend, whose name was Elihu, who had accompanied the other three, finally speaks. He had refrained from speaking until now because, as he says, the other men were older than he, and so he thought he should let them go first. But because Job maintained his innocence, Elihu became angry. Isn't that how preachers respond when they accuse us of being worthless and we disagree? Well, they have no response other than anger and hoping to beat us down with anger. He has the same world view as the other three. Everyone is sinful. The righteous, if they exist, will prosper physically, and the wicked will suffer. Elihu claims to speak from an upright heart, not giving Job the same chance, since obviously Job must be wicked because of what befell him. See, Elihu just assumes because this disaster fell on Job, he must be a great sinner. Elihu claims to utter pure knowledge that the Spirit of God has given him these words, which we'll discover in a couple of chapters is absolutely false. But how many preachers do that? The Lord told me. It's a lie. Elihu wants Job to confess and thereby redeem his soul, when he has not been able to identify even one sin. Elihu quotes Eliphaz, but claims that Job said it and was wrong. So he just mixes up who said what in order to find something to charge Job with. Well, in chapter 38, God finally responds, and he condemns the words of Job's four friends, particularly Elihu. He says in chapter 38, verse 2, "Who is this who darkens counsel by words without knowledge?" God asks the four if they know the purpose of creation. See, that those four friends assumed that the purpose of creation was good behavior, which it is not. If good behavior was God's objective, God is a terrible engineer. Rather, no, God's purpose in creation was to make an incubator for faith. Rather, his idea was, let's develop mutual trust and selfless concern so we know who to keep and who to discard. In chapter 38, verse 15, "From the wicked their light is withheld." It's very much like 1 Corinthians 2, verse 14, and Romans chapter 8, verse 7. The natural man cannot understand the spiritual. And he tells the four friends of Job that, yeah, they're among the people that can't see the light because they are so into themselves and how important their own wisdom is that they can't see God. Well, in chapter 40, verses 3 through 5, Job answers God, very short answer, and he just keeps his mouth shut. A very wise response. God reminds Job that he does not have the power or the understanding to question how God runs things. God challenges Job to accept that God has a larger perspective and to trust that he'll make everything come out. And so in chapter 42, verses 2 through 6, again, very short, Job repents of his complaining. Well, the rest of the story is in chapter 42, verses 7 through 17. God condemns the friends of Job, but he declares the words of Job are correct. So now we know which words in the book to quote and which ones not to quote. God tells Job to prepare a sacrifice for and to pray for his friends, that his friends will repent of their folly, their inaccurate world view. So he does. The friends of Job in chapter 42, verse 9, accepted God's judgment, which I suppose is a point in their favor. And then finally, the last paragraph of the book, God restored double Job's losses. Now, for those who think a little deeper, other than just if you have fine children and a big house and lots of livestock, no. Remember that Job lost all of his children. You can replace the livestock, you can replace the house, but you really cannot replace the children. I'm sure that Job grieved over that for the rest of his life. Certainly, he was helped by God by having another whole flock of children. But that doesn't mean that everything was taken care of. No, Job did suffer because of Satan's boast. Well, that's the end of my introduction and summary of the book of Job, and I hope you will have fun reading it. Thank you for listening.